I mean, there is a whole spectrum, like political spectrum. There are people who are, pushing to the left or pulling to the left. People who are pulling to the right, and these two forces balance, and eventually you get something workable. And if
okay, I have to cut you off. I need to let other people ask. I promise you, I understand your question.
So
okay, so let me address all of those different things. So you raise an important issue of pollution, which I mentioned in passing at the end. So I want to elaborate on that, but I need to give some context to that. So the opposite of a green standard for things, which I regard as a non-human or anti-human standard, is a pro-human standard. Now, it does not benefit human beings to unnecessarily breathe in coal smoke. It doesn't benefit human beings to unnecessarily breathe in smog. So part of having a human standard, or a pro-industrial standard, I might put it, is that you are completely concerned with those types of issues. And the way in which that concern manifests itself politically is via property rights. So you have property rights both of the producer to buy up land and to produce energy, but also of his neighbors to their own air and their own water. So what you had going into the 70s, it's definitely wrong historically to think that, well, we were just having this giant buildup of pollution until then, and then the environmentalists in the 70s saved us. If you look at the air quality trends, the water quality trends, those were gradually improving for hundreds of years, from the farm all the way to modern cities. The reason they were improving is because the more energy you have, the more technology you have, the higher standards you can have for pollution. So there's a real issue in the law of how do you define pollution. Like, let's just do a thought experiment. Imagine you go back to the caveman and he's just discovered fire. And he makes fire, and yet the fire emits smoke. Well, the smoke taken in isolation is not good for his life. But should you ban fire because it has smoke? Well, obviously not, because the net benefit is so enormous of having fire. But yet, the further you go, the more technology you have, the more you can separate the generation of energy from the pollution, which is a fantastic achievement. So if you take, for the most part, the people who went in coal-filled cities were actually better off environmentally than the people on the farm. But thanks to technology, they could move the coal burners from inside their house to central locations, which made the air that much cleaner. And then other technologies like natural gas could come along, and coal purification technology could come along. So all of those are fantastic things. They just need to be, you just need to have clear laws based on human well-being. And you can never forget the context of the value of the energy. So you can't just focus on the pollution in a vacuum and say, oh, coal is bad because it creates pollution. Well, coal is responsible for billions of people being alive today, and we need to keep that in context, whatever laws we make. Now, as far as something like green chemistry and these more private ventures, what I would just ask in every case is, are you using a human standard or a non-human standard? So for instance, if you're pursuing efficiency, well, that's fine if it's really beneficial. But if you're saying, like, I'm gonna buy a bottle that's 3 times as expensive so that I can feel environmentally good, in my view, that's a non-human standard, because it treats something like garbage as a bad thing, whereas garbage is actually one of the greatest achievements in human history, because throughout history we live with our garbage, and it's really great that we can take stuff and put it in a separate place. And if you're worried about it, the Earth running out of space, you don't really understand how the Earth works, because it's got a lot of space on it, and the garbage had to come from somewhere. So you're just moving around matter. So ultimately, and if you guys go to industrialprogress.net, my website, I have some good quotes about this, but ultimately everything we do is just rearranging atoms. And the question is, are we rearranging them to our benefit or to our harm? So I feel absolutely no guilt when I take a great, convenient plastic bottle like this. I enjoy it to the max. It made my talk much more pleasant. And then I throw it out. And I feel great about it. Now, I don't think the government should be in charge of disposing of it. I wish I could just pay someone directly. I think that would be more efficient. But that said, guilt-free garbage. And I highly recommend that policy. In the back.
What are your thoughts on hydrogen and its ability to replace gas in the long run?
So my main thought about every kind of question like this, especially ones that have not been tested too much, is I'm smart enough to know that I have no idea. So often people think that it's the job of people like me to say, oh, we should use this energy, we should use that energy. No, my job is to say we should get the government out of the way and allow producers and consumers to figure that out. Now, that said, just to comment on hydrogen, basically you've got something that it takes a lot. Hydrogen fuel is a human-created form of fuel, which means it takes a lot of energy to generate. So there's no practical way to do that unless you've got something like super, super cheap nuclear behind it. So there is a certain premium that we'll pay in fuel for portability. I mean, we'll pay more for oil per unit of energy than we will for gas because it's super, super, or coal because it's super, super portable. So it's conceivable that if we could produce stationary power cheaply enough, we could make things like battery-powered cars or hydrogen-powered cars cheap. And I think there's some evidence that that could be done, because in the 70s you actually had nuclear plants reporting that they were producing power for half of what coal could. And I think there's a lot of reason to think, just because of the fundamental technology of nuclear, you could produce incredibly, incredibly cheap energy. It's certainly, I'm not speaking, again, you can't predict these things, you need to see how they work. But if I had to bet, like in a free market, what has the most potential, it would be nuclear. And I think that would open up so much you wouldn't even believe it. Just take something like we think we have a lot of energy. If we had 10 times more energy, we'd live in a completely different world. I mean, I live in Southern California, which is basically a desert. It's one of the most desirable places in the world to live. The more energy we have, the more we can do energy-intensive things like desalinate water. So we could desalinate huge amounts of water, create just lush green in the proper human enjoyment sense, right? Huge, forests and farms and all this amazing stuff. I mean, we could really make the earth a more pleasant place. So there's such an upside to having cheaper, better energy. But unfortunately, we're not taught to be excited about the potential of energy. We're just taught to be afraid of it, or afraid of the downside. Yes?
So you said you were going to comment on Chernobyl.
Oh.
Yeah, well,
Well, now I am. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that in the context of like stuff that was 3 Mile Island, which I personally believe was almost an overinflated hype, and then there was the Japanese incident a couple of months ago, which was actually, I think, a disaster.
Well, okay, so whenever we deal with safety, the important issue is, this is true with anything in thinking, but is what is the full context? So if you say something is safe, is it safe, is it not safe? It can't be compared to a fantasy world in which everything is never dangerous. It has to be compared to the alternatives. So the question is, what is the comparative safety of nuclear power? Now, let's take Japan. Imagine if you had had that earthquake and tsunami and a dam had broken, or a coal plant had been hit, or a gas plant had been hit. You can't say this 100%, but I would say 99%, the damage would have been really bad, because you just have all kinds of dangerous materials floating around. The plants are not that sturdy. Someone's shaking his head, but you can explain why later. But it's in terms of certainly something like a hydroelectric dam. I mean, if a dam is hit in the wrong way, it can explode. I mean, it can kill 50,000 people. These technologies are dangerous, and the reason they're dangerous is because whenever you're harnessing large amounts of power, there's always the chance that the power will go out of control. So the question is, what are the chances of the power going out of control? And in the case of nuclear, it's very, very low because of the whole structure. So even in Japan, you had 3 Mile Island, by the way, was, a disaster with a quote-unquote disaster with no casualties of any kind. So the only casualties in that were the people who were rush evacuated away, and that leads to a certain number of deaths because there was all of this hysteria. Fukushima was definitely worse. But we have to keep in context, this is a natural disaster that killed 20,000 people. 20,000 people. 0 people that we know of have died due to radiation. So what it shows is that and this is an old plant, the comparative safety is incredible. Now Chernobyl is a Soviet death trap. Basically everything the Soviets created was a death trap. And I'm not saying that as a joke, I'm saying that very seriously. So even if you look at the comparative safety of how many the Soviet nuclear plants versus the other plants are much more dangerous because the Soviets manufacture things without any regard whatsoever to human life. So there's no containment building on that. It's a very primitive form of thing that was not allowed in the United States or anywhere else in the civilized world. So that is purely an indictment of the Soviet Union, and we should just be grateful that less than 100 people died there, as against the tens of millions of people that died in that dictatorship in general. Yes?
So earlier you mentioned that nuclear power is one of the 2 greatest generators of CO2, but then we didn't get to discuss that. Now later in your talk, no CO2.
I'm sorry, if I said greatest generators, I misspoke.
Twice. Yeah.
I think we clarified the second
a leader in generation.
I don't think it's worth arguing. Let's just make it clear now, and then you can draw whatever conclusions you want about my speaking abilities. Okay, no. So let's. Okay, so when you okay, hold on. When you have a chain reaction, a nuclear chain reaction, to generate heat that heats up water, that creates steam, that moves the turbine, you do not emit CO2. So that's what I'm saying. The process of nuclear power generation does not emit CO2. Okay. So what was the next thing?
That's good. I think that's correct. I think that's not what you said.
I'm glad to have your approval at this late stage. So do we have any do we have any other questions?
Yeah, that's not correct.
Okay, we got one in the very far back.
You mentioned the intermittency problem about green energy not being reliable, and I agree with that. We can't rely on wind energy 100% of the time.
Mm-hmm.